Hello everyone, my name is Mason Rick and today I'm going to talk about credit card chip readers and transactional security. I found this Dilbert cartoon and I thought it was really relevant to today's conversation. So feel free to pause the video and read through it. And if you don't get the punchline right offhand, just take a close look at the waitress's outfit in the second pane and then again in the third pane. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get right to it. Here's a high-level agenda for today. We'll work through each one of these items in a little more detail and then end with some questions to get the conversation going. So terms and definitions, the way I've got them broken up is by the, here we've got the entity, so the buyer. So you and I, whenever we go out to a mall or Kroger or a drugstore, we're the buyer. Another term used to describe us is the card holder. And then the bank that gives us that card and kind of houses our account is called the issuing bank. The seller, or also known as the merchant, is, they are those stores. So the stores in the mall, the Krogers, the CVS's, what have you. And the bank that accepts the money for a credit card transaction is called the acquiring bank. So when you think of a credit card transaction, it essentially happens in 3 steps. Here are those 3 steps, and we'll talk about those in more detail here in just a second. And one last thing I want to make you aware of are just a few acronyms that I may throw around throughout the presentation. So here are those for you, and we'll discuss each one of those briefly over the next few minutes. So to talk at a high level about how credit card transactions work, I've got this diagram here, and we're going to start with, in the upper left-hand corner here, with the buyer. And so what the buyer does is whenever he's ready to buy something, he'll either go online through an e-payment website, or he'll be in a brick and mortar store and use a terminal, and he'll either enter his card information online or he'll swipe or insert his card into the terminal. From there, that information is sent to the gateway. So essentially every merchant has a gateway, a way to push the information and capture the information, and like I said, to push it to their bank's processor. So that's the next step. So the information goes through the gateway to the processor, and from there it goes to the interchange, or that's also known as the card network. So we'll say in this example, I'm the buyer and I'm buying $500 worth of stuff from Amazon on my Chase Visa card. So the information at the interchange goes to the Visa interchange, and from there Visa asks Chase Bank and says, does Mason have $500 on his card so that we can authorize this transaction? Chase comes back to Visa and says, yeah, he does in fact have at least $500 in his credit limit, so let's send that information back through to the retailer, and then I get a notification that the transaction has been authorized. So we've all seen authorization happen. That's the amount of time it takes you to swipe your card and essentially get your receipt, or to insert your card and then be told to remove your card. So that's the authorization process. What happens next is then there's a hold placed on that $500 on my account, so that the seller then knows that that $500 is coming their way. So then the seller can send the goods to me, or if I'm in a brick and mortar store, they feel comfortable that to let me go walk out of the store because of that hold being placed on those funds. And that is called capture. The final step here is when my Chase Bank, through the interchange, so through Visa, sends the acquiring bank, so in this example Amazon's bank, the $500 at the end of the day. And that is called settlement. So settlement typically happens once a day, and it's when all those transactions that happen throughout the day are pushed through the interchange or the network. So just credit card transactions in a nutshell there. So now let's talk about the physical card and how that has beefed up transactional security, going from the old school card, the stripe and swipe, so the stripe card here that you would swipe, to the chips and dip. So the cards now have a little chip, and a lot of times you're told to insert your card. Kind of a slang, if you will, is to dip your card into a reader. So we've got chips and dip as our new cards. So Europe has been using this EMV technology for decades, and the United States is slowly getting on board with that, especially after a lot of the big breaches that happened back in 2014 with Home Depot and Target, like we read about. There's been a bigger push for a more secure card. And in October 2015, there were more stringent rules put on merchants to be EMV compliant. So making sure that they were switching over from the old swiping type terminals to one that would accept the EMV chip. A lot of them that you'll see now will accept the EMV chip and will accept the swipe of the magnetic strip. So some of the benefits and the ways that the EMV technology makes the transactions more secure is because once that card is dipped into the reader, it creates a encrypted code, if you will, that's sent through that authorization process that we saw a couple slides ago. And essentially that data, as soon as it's encrypted, it becomes useless to anyone who steals it, because it's kind of like the blockchain concept that we learned about a few weeks ago. It's just kind of like useless information. Whereas with the old magnetic cards, whenever you'd swipe that, it would essentially send the card number through that authorization process. So if someone could pick off that card number, pick off that information at some point through the authorization process, or when it was being stored in settlement, then you could duplicate that card number very easily. With the EMV technology, it's harder to do that, especially if you're doing it in a brick and mortar store. Well, even online, I guess, it makes it a lot harder to steal the card number, because the information that's actually transmitted is not the card number. The physical cards themselves are also harder to counterfeit. The magnetic strip was very, very easy for people to reproduce, and if you had the right information, you could mass produce a lot of these magnetic strip cards. With the EMV cards, it's essentially a mini computer, if you will, that's inside the card. So that's obviously much harder to counterfeit than a simplistic magnetic strip, which is essentially the technology of a cassette tape, if you remember cassette tapes. And then one of the benefits is that consumers get increased options on how they can make payments, and we're going to talk about this a little more in depth here in a couple slides. But the EMV technology allows for what's called near field communication payments, or NFC payments, and essentially those are the payments that you can make when you either tap a terminal or swipe a device over the terminal without actually inserting or swiping a physical card. So let's talk about some of the benefits to the stakeholders, to the various stakeholders for credit cards. So first, let's talk about the cardholder. One, there's increased security, because with the EMV technology, I have a better feeling that my card information is safe, at least more so than with a magnetic strip. And then the EMV technology also gives me more payment options, like I just alluded to with the NFC, and we'll talk about more in a bit. So those are a couple benefits for me as a card holder. For merchants, there's a lower risk of a data breach, because the EMV information, the credit card information that's sent via the EMV network, is essentially garbage to someone who's trying to steal credit card information. They would prefer to have something that's like the magnetic strip base to get that information. So if a merchant is EMV compliant, there's a lower risk of a data breach. And then it also creates fewer chargebacks. So those are essentially whenever a charge is made and then later disputed, but the merchant's already sent the goods or provided the service, and then the card company and the bank come back and say that was actually a fraudulent payment, so you've got to refund that money, and then that also creates litigation and legal costs and things like that. So the EMV technology has helped merchants cut down on those two things. So banks become they have less liability whenever there's a breach. Back in 2014, 2015, when there was a lot of the breaches, like high-profile breaches around the holidays, the banks were on the hook for those because they're the ones who say, you know, if we monitor your account and if something happens, like we'll make sure that you're whole again. And so the banks were the ones who ended up kind of footing the bill for those huge data breaches. The banks are also, but with EMV technologies, that there's less risk of a breach, so less liability on their part. It also reduced costs because the banks don't have to monitor accounts as closely because there's less fraudulent activity. They also don't have to reissue cards as often because the card numbers aren't being stolen, so there's not as big of a need for those cards. And then finally, the card companies, there's less pressure from the retail industry on the card companies. The Visas and the MasterCards of the world were having a lot of pressure put on them by retailers and retail associations because the cards they were producing were inferior and essentially meant to be copied. And then there's increased confidence by the consumer, which equals more spend on that card, which is good for card companies for more than one reason. So what's next? This is where I'm talking about the NFC, the near field communication. So a lot of us probably already have like a mobile pay or an e-wallet set up, whether it's with our card or with something like a Starbucks app or something like that, where we can initiate a payment with our phone. There's also talk about having implants, so essentially an EMV chip implanted under your skin somewhere so that you can make a payment by just waving that part of your body over a terminal. Biometrics is another one that's kind of neat. So you can make a payment with your thumbprint at a terminal, with your retina. They also have ones that read the veins that are in your palm, and then you verify your identity with like the last 4 digits of your phone number, your social security number. And then finally, another one is a wearable. So pictured here, it's called a Curve ring. Curve is the name of the company, and they're dabbling in creating wearables that have EMV technology. So essentially this guy could hover his hand over a terminal and initiate a payment that way, just with his ring. So here are some references. Feel free to pause on this page and take a look at any of those if you'd like. And then next I have some questions here to get the discussion going. You guys are more than capable of reading, so I won't read these to you. But again, you can go ahead and pause at this time if you want to take another look at them. I appreciate your time today. Hopefully you learned something, and if you have any questions, I look forward to discussing those with you on the discussion board. All right, have a great day. Bye.